In the final desperate months of the Second World War, Germany stood on the edge of collapse as Allied forces closed in from both the east and the west, yet inside the command rooms of Berlin a different reality was being shaped, one built on hope, desperation, and the belief that a last-second reversal could still be achieved. German leaders refused to accept defeat and instead crafted a series of plans, gambles, and illusions that they believed could somehow restore their fading power and shock the world one final time. By late 1944, the German High Command knew that the military situation was almost beyond repair. The Allies had broken through in France. The Soviet Red Army was pushing deep from the east, and German resources were exhausted. Yet, even in this hopeless scenario, German commanders believed that bold decisions could alter everything. They imagined a final sudden stroke, a dramatic shift that would completely reverse the tide of war. They believed Germany had done it once before in earlier wars by striking quickly with decisive action, so they hoped history would repeat itself. One of the cornerstone ideas of this last-second victory plan was the belief that the Allied coalition was fragile. Germany hoped that the Americans, the British, and the Soviets would eventually turn against each other, and Germany could exploit that moment. The Nazi leadership especially trusted the idea that the Western Allies feared Soviet expansion more than they hated Germany, so they believed that if Germany could hold out long enough, a political fracture might arise that would give them the opening they needed. Another key component of this plan centered around the Ardennes offensive, what the world later called the Battle of the Bulge. This was the greatest gamble Germany launched at the end of the war, and it was designed for one purpose: to force the Western Allies into a negotiated settlement and to split their advance. The idea was simple, but incredibly ambitious. Germany wanted to break through the Ardennes region, race to Antwerp, and cut the Allied armies in half. If this succeeded, Germany believed that the Western Allies would be forced to reconsider their invasion plans. The Battle of the Bulge was also built on another hope, the element of surprise. Germany had been pushed back so far that the Allies assumed no more major operations were possible, but the German High Command knew that if they could gather enough remaining tanks, fuel, and manpower, they could launch one more blow that might shock the world. They believed that even a temporary victory could create the illusion of German strength and slow down the Allied push long enough for diplomatic complications to arise. Behind the scenes, Germany was also developing secret weapons that they believed could change the course of the war. These weapons were known as Wunderwaffen or wonder weapons, and they included jet aircraft, rockets, new submarines, and advanced tanks. The most famous of these was the V-2 rocket, the first ballistic missile in history. German leaders were convinced that these superweapons could force the Allies to reconsider their invasion. Germany believed that even if the weapons arrived too late, they could still cause enough chaos to create what they called a strategic miracle. The German jet fighter Me-262 was central to this dream. The aircraft was faster than anything the Allies had. Germany believed that if these jets could be deployed in large numbers, they could sweep Allied bombers from the sky and create air superiority. Again, this would protect German cities and allow their armies to regroup, but production issues, fuel shortages, and Allied bombings kept these jets from being deployed in numbers large enough to make a difference. Yet inside German command rooms, the hope of unleashing a massive jet force remained alive until the very end. Another secret project Germany depended on was the development of new submarine technology. Germany hoped that advanced U-boats with higher underwater speed could break Allied supply lines across the Atlantic and starve Britain of resources. Even in 1945, German engineers were testing submarines that could stay underwater for long periods, a huge advantage over older models. If these submarines had been available earlier, the impact might have been significant, but in the final months, it was too late to shift the war. Germany still believed, however, that even a handful of advanced submarines could force the Allies to divert resources and slow their advance. Germany also hoped to use propaganda and psychological warfare as part of their last-second plans. The Nazi leadership believed that if they could convince the German population that victory was still possible, they could prevent panic and rebellion, they spread the idea that new armies were being formed, new weapons were arriving, and new alliances were being made. Although these claims were mostly illusions, they served a purpose to keep German resistance alive long enough for their other plans to unfold. One of the most desperate strategies was the formation of the Volkssturm, a civilian militia made up of men who were too young or too old for normal military service. Germany hoped that by mobilizing millions of people they could slow the Allied advance and create enough time for other plans to work, but these units were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and often thrown into battles they could not win. Still, the German high command believed that sheer numbers might buy them the time they needed. Another belief inside the German leadership was the hope that winter weather would slow down the Allies. Harsh cold, heavy snow, and poor visibility could all be used to delay enemy movements. This was one of the reasons the Battle of the Bulge was launched in December. Germany hoped that nature itself would become their ally and create the perfect condition for their last-second strike. The freezing forests of Ardennes were chosen deliberately because they offered a chance for Germany to hide movements and attack by surprise. As 1945 began, the German high command was living almost entirely on hope rather than reality. They believed that even a small temporary victory could completely reshape the war. They believed the Soviets might advance too fast and alarm the Western Allies. They believed the Western Allies might fear communism more than Nazism. They believed that a single miracle weapon could shock enemy governments into negotiation. They believed that Germany had faced disaster before and survived, so maybe history would repeat itself again. Inside Berlin, Hitler and his advisors clung to the belief that destiny would save them. They imagined that one final strike by German forces could cause panic among the Allies and force them to retreat. They imagined that Britain and the United States would realize that defeating Germany would only make the Soviet Union stronger. They imagined that the German people would endure anything if they believed victory was still possible. This hope was unrealistic, but it fueled their decisions during the last months of the war. In the East, Germany also launched desperate counterattacks, hoping to slow the Soviet advance. German generals believed that if they could hold certain key areas long enough, they might reach a political settlement. They believed that the Western Allies would eventually intervene to stop Soviet expansion into Europe, and that Germany could use this moment to negotiate a surrender that would preserve some of its territory. But this was based on assumptions rather than facts. The Soviets were determined to reach Berlin, and nothing would slow them down. As Germany continued to lose ground, the plans became even more unrealistic. German commanders started to talk about forming new armies from shattered units, from training divisions, and even from factory workers. These imaginary formations were given impressive names on maps, but in reality, they barely existed. The leadership pretended that these ghost armies could launch new offensives when in fact they had no fuel, no ammunition, and sometimes no soldiers. Yet these illusions were used to justify continued resistance. Even as Allied troops closed in on Berlin, Hitler still believed that a last-second reversal was possible. He imagined that one of his generals would pull off a miracle and save the capital. He imagined that Germany's enemies would fracture just moments before victory. He imagined that Europe would realize that only Germany could stop the spread of Bolshevism. None of these beliefs had any basis in reality, but they shaped the last days of German strategy. In the final weeks, German forces were trapped everywhere, but the leadership continued to demand counterattacks. They believed that retreat meant surrender, and surrender meant the collapse of all their hopes, so they insisted on fighting even when it made no strategic sense. They fought not because victory was possible, but because they believed that something unexpected would happen, ending the war in their favor. They dreamed of a turning point that never came. By April 1945, the German dream of a last-second victory had collapsed completely. The secret weapons were too late. The alliances never broke, the offensives failed, and the German people were exhausted. The Allies continued their advance, and nothing Germany attempted could slow them down. Yet, even on the final day, inside the bunker, Berlin was filled with conversations about miracle solutions that would never